Gary Soule. Today's date is the 26th, right here at the Door County Maritime Museum, Sturgeon Bay location. How are you doing?
Very good, very good.
That's fantastic. Can you just say your name, age, and your position with the museum?
I'm Gary Soule, and I'm 67 years old. I was the first person hired by the Door County Maritime Museum as a curator and also site manager of the old Florida Street original Sturgeon Bay Museum.
Great. Now obviously we've had conversations, but just talk to me as if I was a 12-year-old coming into the museum for the first time from Chicago.
Okay.
So feel free to talk and elaborate.
Sure.
So I'd like to go ahead and just start this off by asking some general questions. How long have you resided in Door County?
Actually, it's over half a century. It's June of 1964.
Is when you came to the museum? Or, I mean, when you came into Door County?
My dad was a U.S. government welding hull inspector, and so all my life been around shipyards. Some amazing stories in that regard. Had a lot of experience, and of course at the time the shipyards were going here, and so we moved from Bay City, Michigan, where I grew up as a kid, over here. And over there it was the Defoe Shipbuilding Corporation.
So then it sounds like you have some strong familial connections to the county. What brought you to the museum?
Well, I've been interested in maritime all my life. Whenever we travel, my dad was kind of unusual in a way that he wanted to immerse the family in the maritime business. Some things you never hear of today. My dad brought me into the shipyards just as a little kid, and he would come in second shift and literally point out a few places where they had these glass bottles at the time, and he wanted me to clean them up. He'd do paperwork, and I'd go throughout the shipyard, crawl up in hull sections 3-4 stories high, clean out the bottles because he didn't want the broken glass. And a lot of interesting stories. My maritime history goes back to being able to visit a lot of things that the average person wouldn't. Oil rigs being worked on down in New Orleans area, the early Texas towers. I've been on 2 different, at port in Norfolk, Virginia, the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers. So had a lot of history. I also worked for a while as a volunteer setting up the horse-drawn hearse display. My grandfather drove it at the Door County Museum, and also I was hired by Circus World Museum for all their great circus parades, all the way for, well, 39 years actually that they held.
So then, what brought you to this particular museum? How long did you stay? And you know, one question: what was your first day like arriving at their own offices?
I was curator for 7 years, starting in 1990 through 1996. I knew C. Ray Christensen for years. Go in the museum and we'd talk. He had me do a display on our family, and he was quite a guy. I remember he had a big ship's horn, and there was a sign there that said, "Blow the ship's horn for 25 cents." And it would be funny. I'd be talking to him in the lobby, and all of a sudden this loud ship horn would just shatter your eardrums, and some kid or adult would have pushed the button and he'd yell out, "25 cents." And that was kind of the old days. It was a ma and pa type museum. When C. Ray Christensen passed away, I knew that they needed to have some people step in right away because it was the start of the season. With the blessing of the board, particular George Orm, Lloyd Spoody was able to volunteer for a while, and in no time they had a meeting, and I was hired as a curator and site manager.
So then it seems that you knew C. Ray Christensen very well. Now, as you said, he unfortunately passed on, but you know, he was around in the museum at some pretty pivotal moments. What are some memories that you have of him, and what did he contribute to the museum?
Well, a lot of it, his setup was really interesting. It's the old Mon type museum where everything was in there, including the yacht basin on the wall, and he was very knowledgeable, but he was an awful speller. And he'd have various spelling errors and stuff. When I came into the museum, my first goal was to secure things that were outside that, while not critical, I felt it was important to rearrange the best I could to get things inside from the back part of the museum. Then I worked on labels, slow but sure, trying to get things organized. Started the first massive book display ordering. We had people who come up from Chicago to get books. My home address was the museum address, and in the winter I'd get all these books coming in, and I would take and organize them, keep inventory records, attendance records, you name it. What's the old expression, a jack of all trades and master of none?
Right. Yeah, I remember you mentioned something along the lines of that your entire living room would be filled with these books.
Absolutely.
Stacks.
And
talk about that a bit.
Yes, and I remember too, in the winter I'd do signs, large signs. At the time we did have Cane Island, there were just the two sites, and but it was a wonderful time to keep busy, keep things going. I remember the life rings, painting them over, and a lot of technical stuff, you know, very detailed. I did a Cane Island Lighthouse, a sketch of it as part of the sign for the first time to try to redo it, as well as the one out at the corner of 3rd and Florida. When I was hired, right after that, Gordon McClellan was hired. He's unfortunately deceased, and Bud Schubert. And then after that, the following season, Gordon had a heart attack, unfortunately passed away. Bud went into another job that he would like to do. It was a welding shop. And I ended up with the opportunity to hire two highly qualified people. And so I hired June Larson and Karen Wickman, and we made a great team.
It sounds like in the early museum days, even the earliest employees were drawn from the local area, from local maritime industries. How did that influence the whole development of the museum? Well,
you know, there's two ways to look at it. There's example, of course, of people coming in from out of the area that have various specialties, which are definitely needed in the present day Maritime Museum here. The olden days, you wanted to take and have people that had knowledge of the area. I was very fortunate, probably the only one around who's actually been up to the top of all 12 Door County lighthouses. The one on South 4th Avenue, Dunlap Reef, was a private home at the time that I was hired, but I made it my point to go over, had a nice visit with them, got to tour, even though the tower was gone, got to tour the facility, and even the Birdcage Lighthouse, extension ladder on that's up at Bailey's Harbor. And so Coast Guard took me to Pilot Island, Plum Island, got a chance to see the interior of those lighthouses. I feel it is important to be able to experience what you're talking about. And one of the things, I would have bus tours, and not to mention the public. The most fascinating, I think, aspect of the shipbuilding business isn't the mold off or steel fabrication or things like that, but ship launchings. And I could tell you an interesting story that I think is really unique. I talked to Ellsworth Peterson, who I knew well, and was given permission as curator to ride in one of the $60 million wooden minesweepers. It weighs 62 tons. And as I tell people, you arrive about an hour ahead of time, you are given a hard hat and a flashlight. You go up a scaffolding, you walk through the boat, that's what the flashlight's for, and then you're up on top, and they announce at a certain point during the ceremony, you have a whistle go off, and that's 60 seconds to impact. You sit down, you brace yourself. The first 5 seconds, you could have a glass of water, so smooth. The last 2 seconds, you literally are going down 20 feet. The ship would draw 11 feet. You also had a drop of about 9 feet. very, very exciting.
So it sounds like you've already talked about some of your more enjoyable and memorable moments at the museum. If you can name, but just like one activity or exhibit or event that was your kind of favorite moment while you worked at the museum, what would that be?
Well, I do have to admit, having a humorous side of me, I did enjoy a number of different smaller artifacts. The ship's bell that we have here brought back memories. I enjoyed it because of the unique nature of it. It created a lot of interest with people, especially with the clam that grew up inside of it and how it got bigger and better than every other clam around. And there was a lot of things, demonstrate the foghorn, that was very interesting. People like sound effects. Visual is nice, but they also like the sound effects. Pilot House in Elba, that was very interesting.
Great. However, what was some of your most difficult or trying moments with your position in the museum?
I think trying to be all places at all times. Sometimes you'd get a bus tour that would come in unannounced. And here again, you had no one right there immediately on call. I mean, remember, this is the old days. And of course, you have the phone, you have everything else going on, and you also have to have someone at the front door when people come in. So it was not unusual, being a maritime family, to quick call up and ask my mother if she would step in, or June or Karen if they were available. And so she would man the front desk while I would be conducting a bus tour.
So you were mostly associated with the Florida Street location, what was once the Rowan offices.
Correct.
Now, that obviously started with, from what I understand, one floor, but then it kind of expanded from there. So can you elaborate on how that museum location grew?
Well, this was already done at my time, but they opened up the second floor. They had two big barn doors like that would open up. They could raise a forklift and put in the Chris Craft. I think it was 28 feet in length. And so here again, you had a larger object that was very important. One thing, we're talking of larger objects, this kind of goes into this, that I'd like to expound on. Here again, trying to talk about things like the huge 167-foot high gantry crane. I've been up that twice, and the second time I here again wanted to get my good assistants, Karen and June, involved. So I made arrangements, and the three of us went up. It's an elevator that goes up the northeast side of the gantry crane, and that is a world in itself. And so when people were talking, including Karen, who used to do bus tours too, it was a wonderful opportunity to explain firsthand what was happening.
Great. So then, obviously this is the 50th anniversary.
Correct.
Of the Door County Maritime Museum. What are some of your thoughts, just more generally, about that long of a time span? What are your thoughts about the museum's 50 years so far?
The time has certainly flied by awful fast. I'm very excited to see the quality of the exhibits here and the staff in the new museum, where you can get more specialization. I'm very excited about the tower project. I think that is going to be a key element, and I do agree it'll be a focal point for the city of Sturgeon Bay.
Great. What would you like to see the museum accomplish in the next 50 years?
Depending on what happens here, I would hope there'd be room to be able to expand. Ideally, I know this is just pie in the sky talk, but I know it'll be done long before that, but depending what would go on the new site, maybe they could incorporate more towards the Oregon Street side, because everyone pretty much going to Door County, at least in Sturgeon Bay, is going to be on one of the two bridges, and I think it would increase the exposure. And as you know, attendance also translate into more income to be able to better preserve artifacts and do things. In my days, money was really a problem, and it was all donations, but you try to put on a good front for the people, go out happy, and I was happy to say we had a lot of repeat business. Bus tours took off. It was just amazing how many bus tours for the first time to really have.
So 50 years back, maybe 50 years in the future, from this point forward, what legacy, if it's one item, one object, one mission, one subject, what legacy would you like to see this museum preserve for those 50 years and into the future?
Well, I think the museum here has done a wonderful job. There's so many different aspects. I mean, we have 3 Coast Guard units alone right here in Sturgeon Bay, and I think it's important because we are such a key element that all this be tied together and preserved in its entity in terms of making sure that the history does not die off. And so often things are forgotten, pushed aside, and that's a nice part that I like about working in museums.
Great. Are there any other thoughts, experiences, or memories that you'd like to share about your time with the Door County Maritime Museum, or even just in Door County that might be related to maritime subjects?
Well, I think I like the idea of being able to work in a small museum. You never would get bored. I mean, there was everything you could do. I mean, right from maintenance, edging sidewalks, cleaning outside artifacts, you know, inside work. It was a variety, and I think that's important that there's a place for those kind of museums too. And yet at the same time I realized that there need to be better care. Some things, when I first became curator, I wanted to put under glass to prevent anyone from touching. You know, you have your hand oils, which is bad. That's one of the problems we have. I'm glad to see, like you have a lot of pictures here, that you have redone them and kept the originals, keep the negatives. As I mentioned to some of the early staff here, ideally negatives probably should be kept off-site or else copies made, so if there ever is a disastrous fire, you don't lose everything.
And then, would you like to leave, you know, a message or some words of thought for anyone who might see this interview at a later date?
I guess I'd like to say that times change. You have to put everything into perspective. As we look back, sure, the museum was old. It was an old building. Exhibits were crowded. But the fact is, they were preserved. They were saved. Thanks to C. Ray Christensen and his foresight to start the Door County Maritime Museum, which is becoming the leading facility and museum on the entire Great Lakes.
All right, well, thank you, Gary Soule.
You're
appreciate
welcome.
you coming by and doing this interview with us. And thanks, of course, for all the years that you put at the museum.
Thank you very much.